between logic models and theories of change, and provide also examples for this, and then ending on how to formulate and use a theory of change before we have Q&As. So let me start with the first question, why a conflict analysis? The conflict analysis should be a starting point for your programming intervention. Often it is done implicitly, especially when we're looking at national or local organizations. But especially in the context that we are working in, it is important that this is an explicit step in the programming exercise, in particular when we are talking about international NGOs or UN agencies, funds and programs in a given country that often are expatriates, and it is important to familiarize yourself with the context that you're working in. The conflict analysis should provide an in-depth understanding of the conflict environment one works in and the elements you want and you can change. Moving on, is after you do your conflict analysis, ideally you would continue by formulating your vision of peace. So you start with an understanding of what is wrong in a society, and then you continue to formulate of what should change. What is your ideal vision of what a peaceful life in this society or this locality would look like? This vision of peace is often related to the organization's mandate and the positioning of the organization and the reach you can have. And it should be just a mere absence of things. That is, no war, or there should be no more violence, or impunity should end. But it should be a positive and detailed formulation that links back to elements in your conflict analysis. After this vision of peace, you would trace back, and even the most ambitious of us won't be able to attain this vision of peace. And within the GPI, YPI, we don't ask you for a formulation of this vision. Nonetheless, this is a helpful full step. And what we do ask of you is a formulation of project outcomes. That is concrete changes that you are trying to affect, and that should be your contribution of this, to this vision of peace that you're trying to achieve. It is your responsibility and also commitment to produce this change as it is formulated in the project outcomes. And again, here it is also key, these project outcomes relate back to the conflict analysis. What is going to change and how it is going to change are questions that need to be answered. And then finally, you would move back and ask yourself, okay, what activities can we do, or what activities do we need to do to bring about this desired change that is formulated as part of the project outcome? I know, and we all have been there, often it is the activities that we start with in our reasoning and thinking, okay, what would we like to do? We were really good at doing dialogue, or our organization is really known for providing good trainings. And often these activities are the starting point. But the way I've described it, starting from a conflict analysis that describes the status quo to a vision of peace, and then working your way backwards to the change that you can produce and what you need to do in order to achieve this change would be one, maybe for some of you, alternative way of thinking about programming. Okay, going more in detail, what are key elements of a thorough conflict analysis? A conflict analysis should identify the key driving factors of conflict. That is, it shouldn't be a superficial description, but it should dig deeper and try to find root causes of the conflicts that exist in a given society. But it should also look at the key driving factors, that it's not just a general overview of all the things that might be wrong in a given place and time, but really try to prioritize your analysis to identify those aspects that are the most important. It should also provide an understanding of the dynamics between different driving factors of conflict. That is, every context that you are working in is a complex one, and there are linkages between different aspects. How is radicalization linked to exclusion? What is the link between corruption and human rights violations? And it is just to give some examples. And you should try to achieve at least some level of complexity in your analysis. Don't oversimplify things on the one hand, but also don't try to turn this into an academic exercise that tries to explain everything. Try to understand some of the key dynamics between factors that you are trying to work on. Other than this, you also should include the identification of main actors and stakeholders in a given context. You could also consider regional and international dimensions, and in particular, not only for this exercise, but in general, the conflict analysis should be gender and youth sensitive, which is something that I will try to detail a bit more now. What you could start with is the specific experiences of women and youth in conflict and armed conflict. These experiences are very varied, so don't fall back on just cliches of like young men with arms or women as victims of a given conflict, but try to bring out the richness of the experience of various groups in conflict. Go further and analyze systematic marginalization, exclusion of women and youth in a given context, but also investigate the potential or already existing positive contributions of women and young people to peace building, so you can build on these further. Then you can also dig deeper and look at roles and relations between different gender and youth populations that don't necessarily have to be limited to conflict, but also can include domestic aspects of relations or relations in the private sphere. I will skip some of these things. You can also then, one thing that is important in the analysis of gender is that gender does not only include women. So broaden your investigation by looking at men, sexual and gender minorities, and especially also in the interaction between these groups and the role that gender norms play in these interactions. Intersectionality is another aspect, so various factors such as gender, age, class, race, ethnicity, religion, they are all linked to one another and they all have links to power. So it might be interesting to look at some of these intersections in more detail. A young man in a rural environment might be having very different experiences than an older woman that is wealthy and of a particular class in the city. These are things that could help to enrich your analysis. And last but not least, be very mindful of the process. Who is conducting this analysis? Who participates and how? What kind of information do you have access to? If you conduct a participatory conflict analysis, is it only elite adult male in capital that are participating, or do you have a wider constituency that is informing your analysis? So this is wrapping up the aspect of the conflict analysis, and we move on now to the formulation of appropriate peace-building outcomes. Project outcomes are positive changes you want to make happen. Again, you are responsible as the organization to bring about the change that you describe in the project outcome. And if you follow the following rules, it might help you to be more precise on what this change is going to be. So first of all, it should be articulated as a desired change that links back to some element of the conflict analysis that you have done before. The outcomes should be articulated at the right level. You should consider the framework of the Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative. So we are looking at projects of 18 months up to $2 million. Even if you're the most efficient organization, you're not going to change the world doing this. So keep in mind the resources that you have and formulate ambitious but achievable goals that should be clear and realistic and take also the time factor in consideration. So what meaningful change can you effect within the 18 months? If we continue, don't be vague. And in particular, be careful with broad terms such as reconciliation, peaceful coexistence, social cohesion, security, democracy. These terms are often vague ideas of what a vision of peace could look like in your context, but they are very seldomly a concrete project outcome. For example, peaceful coexistence can do very different things in very different societies and contexts. So it is important that you are specific about what is your vision, what is your concrete change of what peaceful coexistence, for example, could mean as part of the outcome of your project. The same goes then with verbs such as strengthen, increase, foster. So if you want to increase social cohesion or strengthen peaceful coexistence, what does this look like concretely in practice? And if you can answer this question, put it down as your project outcome. The desired change should therefore be an observable difference in behavior, interactions, institutional performance, group relations, norms, etc. You should ask yourself the question, after your project intervention, who does what differently as a result of what you have done? And often one thing that we encounter is activities are not outcomes. So you should really try to make this difference as well. I will end by briefly touching on one example of what a peace-building outcome could look like and how you could improve it. An example that we have encountered would be, we will achieve peaceful coexistence among the 3 ethnic groups in the district. With what I've said, you could improve this formulation of the outcome, and I make a suggestion. By the end of the project, leaders of the 3 ethnic groups actively engage in a consultation mechanism in the district and thus peacefully resolve common problems. That is not an answer of what social cohesion in general would look like, but it could be your contribution of social cohesion in a given place. So it is one aspect of that you can work towards. It is specific about what your contribution would look like, and it would also help us on the other end to better understand what it is your project is trying to achieve. The formulation of outcomes is often not a concrete science, but often more of an art. So there's also not the perfect formulation of an outcome, but following some of the principles that I've laid out should and could help you to formulate better outcomes. And with this, I hand over to my colleague, Tammy.
Thanks, Salif. So on the basis of a really strong conflict analysis, as Salif just outlined, you've done your conflict analysis. You've examined who are the sort of main stakeholders, who are the protagonists, the antagonists. You've examined the relationship between them and the sort of main areas that are either opportunities for peace or sort of dangers for conflict. And on the basis of that, you've determined kind of, what you and your organization are planning to do to try to address one of those drivers of conflict or opportunities for peace. What we then do, of course, is, as Lee just walked you through, you then are looking for articulations of what your goal is, and then concretely the changes through formulating outcomes. Within our project proposals, we also ask you then to take a step back and develop theories of change. And typically this tends to be one of the weakest elements of project proposals, together with, I think, indicators. And I think that it's weak for a series of reasons that I'll go into in a moment. But maybe just to sort of touch upon one of the main ones is, I think that there are organizational differences in how we define theories of change. And oftentimes those organizational differences bump up against what we would consider to be a sort of logic model of your project. And so I'll begin today by trying to map out the differences between what we consider to be theories of change and logic models. And the big caveat here is your organization may not take this view. I know, for example, UNDP has a much more sort of logic model type of approach to what they consider to be theories of change. That's fine for your organization, but we're the donor, and we actually have structured the theories of change in this way to try to get at some important assumptions that we feel are really necessary to sort of be reflecting upon that are not captured in logic models. So with that, maybe Fareed? Yeah. So here to sort of start with a couple of basic definitions where we see that theories of change are really causal statements that are seeking to explain that underpinning logic behind how changes underlying assumptions. So as you see at the very sort of top of the label, the theory of change seeks to be explanatory. And in that sense, we often caution that it's best done, developing these theories of change are best done at the conceptual or goal stage before an intervention approach has been decided. Because once you've decided on your intervention approach, you're sort of committed mentally and probably somewhat emotionally to a certain direction and a certain menu of things that you're prepared to do that may be sort of cutting you off from examining the assumptions behind why you think those things are going to produce the change. So the second kind of important element of theories of change is that just as your project will have different layers of results, so some are going to be more immediate, some will be longer term or sort of higher or more structural. I think the best projects are those that are able to look at and provide theories of change for these different levels. So as you go from your outputs to your outcomes, and then outcomes to overall goal, you should be able to sort of say what the underpinning assumptions are behind why those collection of things will produce that higher order change. So for us, that's theory of change. It's basically about the underlying assumptions that are driving the change. Logic models, however, we see, at least, as the sort of presentation of the various components of your program or project. In other words, what you are planning to do, the activities, the outputs, are all arrayed in a kind of summary statement that logically flows from one level to the other. And this logical sequence then helps managers understand the flow of the intervention and hopefully then also detect any gaps or leaps of logic. Importantly here, in distinction to theories of change, a logic model requires that you know the programmatic activities before constructing the logic model, right? I mean, how are you going to array all of the various components unless you've already mapped those out in your planning? So theories of change ideally come before that is done, and logic models necessarily come after. And typically, again, we see oftentimes that developing theories of change are incredibly challenging for teams to construct. And I've kind of put two reasons down that I think are kind of driving reasons, but I think there's also an overarching one that applies maybe to all elements of monitoring and evaluation, of which theories of change is often considered part of monitoring and evaluation. And that is, I think people have, just as many people have math anxiety, I think people have monitoring and evaluation anxiety, and where we've mystified some of these terms, and they seem incredibly difficult to try to wrap your heads around. But I just wanted to, before we launch into some of like the more like nitty-gritty reasons why theories of change might be difficult, I want us to sort of sit back and appreciate that as you're, you come into your planning and you come into your project articulation as experts. you know what you're doing. You know the environment, and hopefully you've done some version of the conflict analysis that Salif has mapped out, so that you've actually structured your thinking around drivers of conflict and opportunities for peace. And so you know this stuff. At heart, you know why you're doing what you're doing. A theory of change merely asks you to make those assumptions behind what you're doing explicit, so that you can examine those assumptions and determine whether or not they're appropriate. So first of all, relax when you're trying to develop theories of change. Relax and have confidence in your own experience, in your own knowledge. Almost every time that we've done workshops around theories of change, actually every time, there's never been a time when we've done workshops in theories of change when participants have not generated outstanding and appropriate theories of change on their own with support. And precisely because everyone who is engaged in this actually are experts, and they actually do know what they're talking about, just as you do. Okay, so beyond the sort of caution to relax, there are some sort of concrete, I think, reasons why theories of change tend to be challenging. One is, I think we often begin with what we want to do and try to rationalize later why we believe it will be effective. It's the, you know, I have a hammer and I'm looking for a nail problem. So as an organization, my organization may be extremely adept at doing employment projects. And so I will look for opportunities to be doing employment projects everywhere where maybe that's not the thing that's going to bring about the kind of change that you're envisioning. So the suggested correction for this is to try to begin generating multiple and these sort of layered theories of change after conceptualizing your main goal, like your overarching area of work and what you're trying to do, but before your intervention strategy has been chosen. Before you've actually made a commitment to what the series of things are that you're going to do. This will enable an overall brainstorming of the necessary conditions to meet the goal, and you may find out actually that, you know, there are maybe 4 or 5 necessary conditions in order to achieve the overarching goal. You may be prepared to provide 1 or 2 of those necessary conditions, to work toward those necessary conditions. But there may be other outstanding areas that need to be put in place first before you can actually anticipate getting some sort of traction on this problem. And those gaps are important gaps to either try to fill or to hold as risks to the project implementation. And I think this is, again, why theories of change are so useful. They help you actually consider what is the broader picture, and how is what I'm anticipating doing expected to change within this environment. A sort of corollary of this is that I think sometimes when we have deep normative commitments to certain areas of work, or these sort of taken for granted notions about what is right and what is not right for society, we sometimes, that obscures our driving assumptions. So our driving assumptions sort of get buried underneath what we sort of have as taken for granted notions of right and wrong. And I think, again, here, I don't want to call out one area over another, but just for purposes of illustration, I think oftentimes we typically kind of see these challenges around human rights commitments, projects that are seeking to advance transitional justice. And here, I think maybe examining, just taking a little bit of time and looking at the difference between reconciliation and transitional justice, for example, is kind of instructive. So if you're coming from a human rights framework, I think a sort of theory of change driving a sort of human rights approach to transitional justice might sort of see you saying that, if victims exercise their rights to accessing justice, peace will be more sustainable. But we would ask you then to keep asking yourselves why. Why is peace going to be more sustainable if victims are accessing justice? Because I think that there's a leap there, that it may produce a more sustainable peace, and it may not produce them. It actually may kick up more tension. But it doesn't mean that working in transitional justice is not the right thing to do. We're just asking you to keep asking yourselves why. And I think this also applies, and Sarah, who's sitting next to me, may land up hitting me, but I think this also applies to women's empowerment and gender equality, where we have a lot of sort of normative commitments to in working toward gender equality or women's empowerment. And we're asking you to unpack the question, why? Why for peace building is this important? So it's not merely enough that women are able to exercise their rights. That's an equality kind of rationale, which is fine, but it's not necessarily peace building. We need you to ask one more question and like sort of really reveal those assumptions about why women accessing their rights or exercising their rights will help lead to a more just peace or a more sustainable peace. Yeah, so I think moving on. So the question is, why is all of this important? And I'm hoping you can see the cartoon here. The illustration actually is showing, I think, what can happen when you charge ahead with your idea of what is needed without really fully considering the context, right? Both bridges and boats will theoretically get you across water, but clearly in this context, the bridge probably wasn't the right choice. And I like this example because it also shows this project team is actually forced, in fact, to reflect on their choices and to sort of question their underlying assumptions in the midst of the project, right? So most interventions that we see aren't as, like, you don't come to a point like as on this bridge where you realize, like, maybe we should be re-examining our basic assumptions about this. Most of our interventions are a little more subtle. But I think as this illustration is sort of urging, the power of a theory of change is that as we go through project implementation, we can keep revisiting the theories of change and keep asking ourselves, do our assumptions still hold? Are the assumptions still valid as we're going through project implementation? And they may actually, you may find that they're not, that's no longer valid for a variety of reasons. So perhaps the context has shifted, either for the good or for the bad. Perhaps a peace agreement has been signed, for example, or maybe conflict has broken out again in a certain area that is affecting the context in which you're working. By going back and revisiting your theory of change, you can be revisiting the assumptions that are driving the things that you're choosing to do without needing to wait until the very end of the project to discover that you should have changed something along the way to adapt. And I think it's important to remember, this is a strategy that is employed by evaluation teams, right? Oftentimes, they will either be looking at your theory of change to understand how you expected things to unfold, or in the absence of a theory of change, they will develop one for you, but apply it after your project. So you won't have the benefit of using that mechanism to help you reflect on your project. But your project at the end of the day will be held accountable for it. So better to do it in advance and to keep assessing your progress against the theory of change. So basically, don't wait until you're running out of stones for your bridge, as the illustration shows, to start questioning whether or not your assumptions still hold. So just to wrap up a little quickly with an example. So here, sort of building off of the example that Salif was also using, if we see that the overall programmatic goal, like maybe your organization has a particular expertise or a particular niche in working on governance, so maybe your overall goal of your organization in a given context is improved local governance. And as Salif sort of mentioned to us before, this is not in and of itself an outcome, right? It's just an area of work, and it's an overall kind of nebulous goal. To turn it into a project outcome, we need to make it more specific. And here we have a sort of proposed project outcome as local governments engender confidence by being responsive to all of their citizens. So here, again, there's a sort of theory of change driving this selection. So local governments engender confidence by being responsive to all of their citizens. What are my assumptions here if that's the thing that I'm choosing to do? And one possible theory of change might be that, well, we believe that local authorities will be more responsive to appeals from their citizens if they're made by joint constituencies. So if local authorities cannot basically divide and conquer and exacerbate social divisions or take advantage of appealing only to one group over another group, if these appeals are made jointly by even groups that otherwise might be opposing, then local authorities will need to be more responsive in a way that is more equitable or not particularistic. So if that's our overall project outcome and a theory of change that is sort of articulating that the assumptions driving that outcome, maybe our project approach then is something like youth. We want to work with youth, that youth are able to cross ethnic, religious, or class divisions to jointly mobilize to demand better access to education. And here, a sort of theory of change here is, we have to sort of examine why youth. Why are youth important actors in trying to contribute to holding local governments accountable for being responsive to all of their citizens? And here, a theory of change in this regard might be because of their mutual exclusion from economic or social or political power and decision making, youth may be more inclined to cross social divisions to work together because they realize that they're all marginalized regardless of what group they're coming from. That's one theory of change. It may or may not hold, and it's something that should be examined and tested throughout the whole life of the project cycle. So as I finish up today, I just also wanted to provide a distinction here, circle back around to look at the difference between what a theory of change would be and what a logic model is for this example. So here we see again the project outcome, local governments engender confidence by being responsive to all of their citizens. The approach that we're using is that youth are the sort of generators of this change because they are going to cross social divisions in order to mobilize together to demand access to education. We've articulated two different theories of change for these two different levels of the kind of change that we're looking for, the project outcome and then the sort of more particularistic kind of approach. And the difference between this and a logic model is that the logic model will begin to sort of summarize in a sort of stepwise fashion the various things that you are going to do within your project to help support youth in jointly mobilizing to demand this. So here the logic model, a phrase around a logic model would be something like when youth capacity to mobilize is increased and youth are provided with spaces for cross-ethnic relationship building, they will then cross social divisions and better hold local governments accountable for delivering access to education equitably. And this logic model will be paired with a results framework, which we'll get into next week, that will very clearly articulate what the project outcome is, what the various inputs for each outcome are, and how we're going to measure that through time to see if our project intervention is having the change that we had anticipated, and also to test the theory of change and whether our assumptions are still holding. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you for your patience and your attention. And we'll open it up for questions now across the whole board between conflict analysis, setting appropriate outcomes, and then teasing these things out through theories of change and the distinction between theories of change and logic model. Thanks.
So we have a first question through the chat function. Please feel free to send us your questions via chat in English and French. Vous pouvez aussi poser des questions en français sur le chat.
Yeah, so actually the very first question that I see comes from Claire Desmond, and I very much appreciate you asking this because I meant to mention it, so thank you for catching an omission on my part. The question is, if we are presenting some of the key aspects of our theories of change as if-then statements, so for example, if we do X then and Y, then we will see the outcome. And the question is, does this match with how we think of theories of change? The answer is yes, in principle, and oftentimes this is a sort of suggested framework for trying to help people think through how to present a theory of change. It's not, oftentimes, however, though, it also becomes a straitjacket. So you may present your theory of change as an if-then statement, but you're not required to. And then the only other caution on the if-then statements is we've seen a tendency to slip into the sort of logic model on the if, on all of the ifs. So everything that gets lumped into the ifs is a series of statements about the activities that will be done. So if we train women and we pass policy legislation that requires local authorities to include them in decision making, and we provide opportunities for whatever the topic of the day is, let's say it's like where to put small scale infrastructure, then women will. So we don't want this sort of iteration or summary of the various project elements as a series of ifs. They should, importantly, just keep asking yourself, are these assumptions about what I'm doing, or are these the concrete things of what I'm doing? If they're the assumptions and they come in an if-then statement, great. If they're the things that you're doing, I would say keep it for the logic model and keep revisiting your assumptions and keep asking yourself why.
Maybe we can read an example of a theory of change from a previous GYPI project that you will also find in the guidance note that's on the website. So if critically vulnerable youth to involvement in conflicts, 1, strengthen leadership and critical thinking skills, 2, are involved in promoting civic engagement, 3, relate to positive role models in the media, 4, have opportunity to engage with elder counterparts in law enforcement and local government in decision-making processes, then they are less likely to join religious and nationalist extremist groups and can contribute to community resilience and can develop constructive ways to address grievance because they will have a sense of belongingness to their communities and are empowered and entrusted to build dialogue across divided lines. So that was very long, but you see that it's not as simple as the kind of if-then notion here. And again, you can find that example in the guidance note that's on the resource section of the PBF GYPI website.
There's a French.
Yeah, there's a French question, but it's not quite related to the topic of today. I'll translate quickly. The French question it states that the priority areas in the guidelines are not the same. The priority guideline areas in the guidelines are not the same as in the application form. It's a statement. I turn to you to clarify this, maybe, or we clarify this later.
Yeah, we can clarify this later.
Merci pour la question en français par rapport aux les priorités dans le guidelines par rapport dans le formulaire d'application. On va clarifier ça et de retourner vers vous avec une réponse. On est un peu surpris par ça, mais on va clarifier ça.
So one question about the recording of the webinar. Yes, we will be uploading the recording of the webinar on the resource section of the website, where you will also find the past webinars, as well as email them to you next week.
Yes. Also, I mean, as people are maybe reflecting on if they have questions and maybe hopefully typing them, if I can actually make a request of all of you. So in the presentation, I sort of mapped out, you know, the sort of anxiety that people have over theories of change, as well as, you know, having the hammer and the nail problem, like we know what we want to do and now we're going to rationalize why we want to do it, or the, you know, normative commitment to something that obscures our assumptions. If you also have other challenges around theories of change that are not captured in this sort of list that I've created, I'd love to hear it, because it'll also help us understand how you're approaching programming, various ways in which we can provide better targeted support and guidance, and it'll overall, I think, help improve our ability to support you.
Colleagues, any more questions? Now is the moment to ask them. You can also ask specific examples that you might have in mind.
Okay, great. And I think we see a couple of more private, like one-on-one questions that we will follow up with separately, related to eligibility, and we will also be sure to place the answers, sort of generalized answers to those kinds of questions also on the web, because if they're relating to eligibility in a given country, chances are other NGOs or CSOs in that country face the same kinds of questions, but we will address that separately. And for the online application stage, we do not need to submit a logic model, right? I mean, elements of it in the sense of we need to be able to sort of see, and the online application asks for overall outcomes and a sort of sense of what the programmatic approach is. So, in essence, the answer is yes, even if you're not required to put it in a sort of very structured results framework. We're not asking for a full-fledged results framework at the point of the concept note stage. But we are asking for a little bit more detail than what we've done in the past, for example, so that we can actually see what it is that you're planning to do, and also for ourselves test it against your theories of change. Since this is the first time that CSOs are being evaluated, will proposals be evaluated in country first, selected by the national body designated and moving forward, or will the CSO applications go straight to, I guess, to us? Well, actually, this is the second time that CSOs are being evaluated. Last year was our first experience in trying to do this, and we will follow a sort of similar model as last time, which is that the online application process is the mode through which everyone, CSOs and the UN alike, will upload and apply for the funds. The applications will then be reviewed by our team here in New York, and at that point we will identify those that we select as strongest and which will be invited to expand into a full-fledged project project proposal. When we do that, we will also be contacting our sort of senior UN management in the relevant country. So if you're applying from, let's say, Sri Lanka, we will, assuming that you pass the first stage in the review here at New York, we will then contact the UN resident coordinator in Colombo and ask for their input into the things that you are proposing to see how it fits with the overall UN portfolio, to sort of see how it fits with UN and government priorities, so that we can make an informed choice in the entire context. I hope that's clear. So the stage we then share with the UN.
In the meantime, there were two questions about linkages, theories of change, etc. One was asking, how about the link between employment and its contribution to mutual understanding, equality, or opportunities? And the other one was, could health be a bridge for peace? Though the questions were sort of framed in the vein of theories of change, I think it would be helpful to go back to the part of my presentation, in the sense that what would be important is to understand what is the problem in a given context. When you say something, health as a bridge for peace, what we would need to know, what is the point of departure, what are the conflicts in a given society, and what is the outcome that you are trying to achieve? What is the change that you want to make? In that sense, peace is not precise enough, I would say. You have to break this down in what kind of peace or what elements of peace you want to bring about. And only then, I would say, would you be at the stage where you could sort of develop this sort of theory of change, of how your intervention that would be in the health sector and would mean improvements in the health sector could or could not be a contributing factor for peace. The same goes with employment. There, for us, it would be important to understand what is the conflict situation at the moment, and what is the change that you are trying to affect, and then we could understand how employment could be linked to mutual understanding or equality, and whether or not this would be a sort of sound theory of change of how activities that might include the increase of employment opportunities might actually have these positive effects that you are trying to produce.
I could give one example just to make it a little more concrete. I won't name the country, but I can tell you in one country where the Peacebuilding Fund is active, their colleagues were talking about a proposal related to female genital mutilation, which ordinarily we would consider a protection or health issue. But in this context, elected officials were using the legality of FGM to basically stir conflict and factions in the political process leading up to an election. So there you could see how an issue that we normally would consider a protection or a health issue was being manipulated by political parties, and so then very much became a peace-building issue. And that's where you would need a very robust theory of change to connect issues related to, or activities related to, FGM to the overall outcome of improving stability and peace building in the country.
Yeah. And then just one last little bit on employment. The World Bank, the Peacebuilding Support Office, UNDP, and ILO last year produced a research piece that is also a sort of guidance for employment and peace building. And I think as a programmatic guidance, I think its strength lies in actually identifying some standard theories of change that are usually driving employment projects. So if you're struggling and looking for inspiration around employment, maybe you can turn to this employment and peace building study that is on the PBSO website, and we can pull it out and upload it also if it's not already onto the GPI YPI website. I would also caution you, though, not to simply cut and paste. So again, the theories of change are incredibly useful if they're sort of triggering deep reflection on the part of those who are creating or drafting the project. If you're just sort of cutting and pasting conveniently something that someone else has done, you're not really going through that kind of mental labor that will help you better understand your project. Yep. I think that's more or less it. The sort of pace of questions seems to have abated. We will be posting both the recording with the PowerPoints, and we'll also post the PowerPoint in French on the website, as always. And beyond that, thanks very much for, yet again, your participation, and we look forward to meeting you all next week for the final PowerPoint of this series, which will be looking at strengthening monitoring and evaluation approaches within the project. So thanks very much.